Well, he's back. After I had a bit of a shocking couple of days, still not great health-wise, still lame, but played one game this morning and we played the French defence against another 1400 rated player, and this one is just a beauty. Absolute beauty. I think I've got one inaccuracy in the whole game. My opponent didn't play brilliantly, but you know what? Sometimes your opponents don't play brilliant, and sometimes they are fantastic, very, very sharp, very tight, very awake. Sometimes they are loose, and you need to be ready. Simple as that. Okay, let's go through the game because it's a really lovely game. Okay, so e4, e6, the French defence, d4, d5, normal opening, and we have the advanced variation. Now c5. And we have knight out to f3, knight to c6. Okay, so now I've got two attackers on this pawn. So with this setup, generally in the French, we'll just do some kind of French basics here. Your initial target is going to be this pawn. And you can add, so I've got two attackers against it now. Obviously one wing pawn, which I'd like to exchange for it. But you can also then add like queen to d6. Sorry, b6 adds another attacker to it as well. So quite often at the lower levels you'll see c3 played, which is actually what we get next. But also we can have knight to c3, knight to d2 are common. There's quite a few different replies to the French. So now that c3 is played, it really doesn't make much sense for me to continue my attentions towards this pawn, because if I start any exchange with c takes d4, we're just going to have c takes d4 again, and nothing's really been lost or gained. It's kind of inconsequential, right? Sometimes in the French you'll see like the bishop come to there, or the knight come to there, or even the bishop come to there, say without this pawn here, right? So there's several ways that White can inadvertently block the defense of this pawn, and when they do so, you should just capture the pawn. Okay. Now, apparently, the computer wanted me to capture the pawn at one point as well, but I can't remember what point that was. There was I think even here, actually, on move 4, it just wanted me to capture the pawn because I'm exchanging a wing pawn for a centre pawn. Okay. So if you can do that and get away with it, it says do it. You know, so that's what I should have done. Anyway. Knight c6 is played, c3, and now because this pawn is no longer such an appealing target, because it's now defended 1, 2, 3 times, yeah, and only attacked twice, yeah, I could add a third attacker, but then we can have bishop e3 as well, adding a fourth defender. It's just not worth the time to try and line up more attackers against this particular pawn. So what you then can do is start to target the e5 pawn. So the second major pawn break after c5 in the French is very often f6. Okay, so what we're trying to do is we're trying to undermine this pawn structure in the middle through any means necessary. And if e takes f6, you can have knight takes f6, and you bring out your bishop, castle, put your rook on there. You've got a semi-open file for your rook. King's very likely to castle kingside. So that's all good. And then, of course, with removing this, you then open up this long diagonal as well for attacking ideas. So, what happens in the game? a3 is played. Bit quiet, bit close to the chest. We're on move 6, and look at the lack of development on White's side, right? I mean, I'm not much better, but I do feel like I've got a nice central presence now. I've advanced 4 pawns into the centre. This is maybe, I don't know, a bit slow. I mean, what's it doing? It's not stopping the knight from going to b4 because that's already covered by the c3 pawn, yeah? So maybe White's idea is to push b4. I don't know, but it's a lot of pawn play. Anyway, so I now take the opportunity to capture on e5 and just disrupt. So look now, I've got 4 pawns in this central pod, right? We have d captures on e5. And now we've obviously got one knight attacking, one knight defending, that's all. So now I push h6 because I just don't want this knight or this bishop to come in here. And we have bishop to e2, so white's getting ready to castle. Now I play my knight to e7. So obviously my knight can't come here on f6 because of this pawn. So what I'm figuring is that maybe the knight might come around to g6. Then we've got two attackers on the pawn from there, two knights looking at it. We have knight d2, and now I put my knight on g6. So I can't actually see any way for white to defend this pawn. Now it's because of the exchange, because we had this exchange here, the d pawn became the e pawn, and there's no way to support it right now. So we have knight b3, and now I grab the pawn. So I'm a pawn up. We have an exchange of knights in the middle of the board, and now look at this kind of sense that black has real dominance over the center of the board. So I'm feeling pretty good at this point. Yeah. I'm controlling all of these squares as well as this one and this one and this one with my knight. So it's going to be challenging now for white to get their pieces out to the most effective squares. And if you think about it, when you've got a knight anywhere inside this square, I've said this lots and lots of times, then it's looking at its maximum number of squares, which is 8. Okay. So anytime it's in this central 4x4 square, that's good for knights. Also with bishops, say like a bishop here, how many squares is it looking at? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and let's not really count the backwards ones, but 8, 9. Okay. Now, if I was to put, let's say that this pawn was a bishop. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, potentially a lot more squares. You see? A lot more squares if the piece is centered. So we're talking about control of the board. Really, really key thing. So I've got a nice knight now in the center of the board. This knight is outside of the 4x4. So this knight here is controlling how many squares? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, potentially 6. And the other two are off the side of the screen. Okay. So now, what does white do? Another kind of quiet move. I don't get this one. I mean, it's like the bishop and the queen are both looking at g4 and also f3. So this isn't necessary to prevent my knight from coming in. So I think my opponent's missing a trick here with these slow pawn moves. We've had a3 and now h3. When what he's not doing is getting his king to safety. What he's not doing is getting his bishop out and his queen and connecting his rooks, yeah? Likewise, I'm slightly behind on development myself, so we have bishop d6. Nice square for the bishop, also preparing to castle kingside, get the rook onto this nice file. The bishop's also now looking down at h2. It's still defending this pawn, and now we have one defender of this knight that was previously undefended. White castles, black castles. Now, queen to c2. And I have to evaluate, what's the any potential risk from this queen right now. Could white be thinking about a bishop sacrifice? Bishop takes h6, g takes h6, queen in here. I'm not massively concerned. I mean, the knight's covering that. I've got queen covering that. I've got the rook that can come and block. I think I'm all right. My problem piece at this point is probably my light squared bishop, because it's just looking at the back of that pawn's head and this pawn's head right there. Very often your light squared bishop is a problem piece in the French, so sometimes you'll find this bishop wriggling round, or even to here and then maybe into h7 might be an idea. But I do need to think about improving this bishop at some point. So anyway, I play queen to f6. I just want to make make sure that my king has got enough defense from pieces here on the king side, because I don't want to get unpicked by this. I have played this h6 move, slightly weakening on the light squares, and white still has a light squared bishop. So I just want to shore things up a little bit. I'm quite happy with the level of control I've got over the board. I feel like I'm on top at this point in time. We've only spent 2.5 minutes so far on this entire game. So white finally completes development. This is move 15 with bishop e3. But again, this is not the ideal place for bishops to be. If you look at it, both bishops are firing down because they're kind of, they're boz-eyed. They can't, they attack at diagonals. So, you want your bishops over here where they are looking down towards the enemy king, right? You don't want them, hang on, it's drew me arrows wrong there, That's where you want your bishops. You want your bishops around here, right? If they're in the middle rear of the board, they're just looking at the sides of the playing area. So no massive threat from those bishops right now. Okay, my bishops here, admittedly, they are looking down towards the king side, and that could prove instrumental. So I now play b6 because we had here 2 attackers on this pawn and only 1 defender, so I just push b6 to add a second defender. And now there's some counterplay down the queen side. So a4 is pushed, I lift my bishop to d7, maybe ideas of getting my bishop to c6, and then a pawn push, right? You just always need to be thinking about how can I improve my pieces on every turn. Ideally, if you are calling the shots in the game particularly, then you want to be in a stronger position after each turn that you play. You want to be improving the overall position of your pieces, the overall amount of control that you've got over the board. It's harder to do if your opponent is attacking, pressurizing, and they're calling the shots. So just getting that tactical edge over your opponent, that's why it's so critical. Okay, so now a5, another pawn push. But I'm kind of unconcerned about this. I'm figuring like I've got my pieces over around my king, and white doesn't really have any kind of piece pressure on this side. There's only really this rook that could cause any damage. So I figure, pawn takes. If he wants to take my rook, I just recapture with my rook, and then I've got the open A file. So I'm not too bothered. But then I figure, okay, if he takes out this pawn, I'd just like to make sure that I'm secure here. This is potential weakness, and he's got a couple of bits lined up against it. So let's just shore things up. He takes, I take back, and I'm happy there. Okay. Now rook a7 attacks my bishop, but it's defended by the knight. So another really, really key thing, particularly if you're like sub 1000, it's very tempting when you see an attack, because it's an attack, but you shouldn't react to the attack. You should say, okay, let's evaluate this threat. How much of a threat is it? Is white going to give up his rook and then I recapture with a knight? That would be unfavourable for white. The other thing you then have to ask is, does white have an easy way of dislodging this knight from the defence of that? It's called removing the defender or deflecting the defender. So maybe f4 might come at some point, and then if my knight has to move, then maybe my bishop could be under threat. So I decide just to move my bishop to c6. So now I've just kind of cleared this 7th rank. I was like, okay, rook, you've come in here. Now, there's nobody here. Everyone's run away. Also, this bishop's now defending this pawn. And it's, instead of on this diagonal, it's now looking at this diagonal down towards the king. So what's not to like? I've really got, it feels like, 300, where Leonidas gets his 300 Spartan warriors, and they just occupy this central point, and it's almost like it doesn't matter how many opponents come at them, because they own the hot gates, they own this strategically critical part, and that's what it feels like in this game, that my dominance of the center is really helping. So now bishop takes c5, and all I can figure is that white here is simply running out of options. They simply haven't got anywhere to go. I mean, this knight can't improve itself, can't get anywhere close towards my king, right? These bishops just have no squares really to go to. You can't go there because of the queen, or there because of the queen, Can't go there because it'll be captured. This bishop likewise just doesn't have many prospects. So for some reason, white decides to sack his bishop. I recapture with the b pawn. Okay, so now look, again, I've got very strong pawns, and backed up by all the king's horses and all the king's men are in this like huddle in the middle of the screen. So rook attacked bishop. Again, evaluate the risk. It is defended. It's actually defended twice. Rook and knight. So point of this move, don't know. So now I propose a trade of rooks. I say, go and take the bishop. Lose material, give up the exchange, I don't care. And now rook to a1. Okay, now there's only 3 more moves left in the game for each player. So can you see how black could potentially checkmate white in 3 moves? The game ends in checkmate. And this is kind of funky and interesting. I mean, if this was a puzzle, I'd be scratching my head for 10 minutes on this one. But I managed to checkmate white here in three moves. Okay. So the first thing that you have to look at is, well, what did my opponent just play and why? So I think this was an overreaction by white. You know, he's in the US, it might be late at night for him, he might have had a beer or two, who knows. But you see, I've got a rook attacking this rook. And like we said, you've got to evaluate threats. How much of a threat is it? Well, look, it's defended by the light square bishop there. That rook is defended. There's no reason to play this rook to a1 to add a second defender. Unless the idea is that if rook takes, and you know it's very important to occupy the a file. But the whole thing about chess is evaluating different kinds of imbalances, and the problem with this move is that he's undefended f2. And look, I have a queen and I have my rook eyeing down on f2. So I mean, this is a much more serious threat than rook takes rook and bishop takes rook. Okay, so the first move by black is queen takes f2 check. Right, so I looked at this. I knew the king would be forced to go to h1. Right, now what I want to do is I want to get rid of this rook, because I want to play queen e1 just out of the way of this bishop, force the king here. Right, so rook takes rook, and now a blunder by white, rook takes rook. Did he even see that the bishop was looking at this? Well, in fact, bishop cannot capture here. But I still think the computer, when I looked at the analysis, actually said bishop takes is best, because we now have a forced checkmate. After rook takes, okay, queen e1 check, there's only one move. King has to go to h2, right? And now, look at this. Knight f3. Okay? Yeah, it's a check by the knight. And the pawn could capture the knight, but there's also, it's a double check because the bishop is there as well. So, very often in a double check situation, the king has to move, right? But when the king is in check by a knight, unless you can capture the knight, the king has to move. You cannot block a knight check, right? But here, because it's a double check, and one of them is by a knight, the king must move, and the king has no squares. No squares to go to, completely trapped, check and mate on move 25. So, absolutely fascinating game for me. And just look how these, how we get to that position. Okay, so this is this has been seen countless times. Okay, this counter strike, this early pawn break with f6, and white doesn't respond to it. White plays a quiet move, just loses the initiative to some degree. Takes, and now this pawn is weak. It's undefended, right? And they've allowed black to get this central control. That's a prophylactic move. Now the knight manoeuvres itself round, and this pawn's a goner. Repositions his knight. Trade of knights, okay? I don't know if that was necessary. I think it might have been even preferable for white to allow me to capture and then recapture rather than offering up his knight. Because I've now ended up with his lovely central knight, and his knight is poor by comparison. Okay, centralized bishop, castles, and now look, my rook is on this semi-open file. As we've seen, that semi-open file becomes instrumental later on. Putting the queen on the same semi-open file, right? This is not an immediate threat, but what I'm doing is I'm laying the groundwork for future threats. It means, and I remember saying to myself, at the time, it means this rook is now tied to the defense of this pawn, right? So you've got to talk to yourself like that. Say, okay, this is a threat. What am I doing with this threat? Am I setting up a pin? Pins are great threats, right? It means a piece can't move. More than likely can't move. Okay, so you want to just think about, in the middle game, setting up your future attacking possibilities rather than just going all out for the attack, particularly with only one or two pieces, right? It's about improvement. Improve your pieces, improve their position, point them at the right part of the board, get them coordinated. And coordinated means that everything's kind of defending each other. Your pieces are working as a team rather than individual units. Okay, so now bishop out here, not a great square for the bish. Pawn, little bit of messing about on there. For some reason there's a bishop sacrifice. That's a half-hearted attack. It's just like a prod, Someone walks up to you and just prods you. It's like, stop it. Away with you, right? We're playing serious chess here, right? So now proposed trade, doesn't like that idea. Rook comes across, again unnecessary. This is unforced. And I mean, that was the main blunder. I'm now like something like 27 plus here, because this is basically almost a forced mate. King moves, and this was just wrong. I mean, what he should have done is bishop takes, but then I grab the queen, and it's going to be a formality anyway. So yeah, it leads to a really, really beautiful checkmate. So it's nice to put the ghosts to rest, from my terrible play yesterday. I don't think my opponent played fantastically in this game, but thank you, Michigan Knight, for a very enjoyable game. And I'm just starting to feel that little bit fresher. I'm still persevering with the French defence. My coach is trying to get me to venture into some Sicilian play, but I don't know. What I like about the French is that with e6 on the first move, and very often followed up with d4 on move 2, you are saying to your opponent, okay, we are now playing the French. You know what I mean? No, we're not playing your move. So, for example, let's just go back to the start. If you play, let's pull up the analysis board, yeah. So as black, if your opponent plays e4 and you play e5, the reason I don't want to play e5 right now is because we don't know what we're going to get. I mean, yes, very likely you're going to get knight to f3, okay? But then, okay, knight to f3, and then you've got some opportunities. If you play knight c6, then, you could find yourself in all kinds of territory. Your opponent might be very familiar with the Italian, or they may be very, very familiar with the Ruy Lopez, the Spanish game, right? Or they may be a Scotch player and play d4, okay? Or they may go for the 4 knights, okay? And, you need a way to respond to all that stuff. So, I don't want to just return the serve and then let my opponent decide which part of the court he's going to play in. I want to say to my opponent, okay, I'm going to make you think, and I'm going to try and just do like a little chip over the net, and I'm going to try and take control of this game myself. So there are ways to do that. I mean, the Sicilian, of course, is very popular, but then there's umpteen ways that your opponent can reply to that. Right, you've got this weird Snyder variation that I've played with for a bit. You've got the Alapin variation where you play c3 and prepare d4, right? And then if takes, and you've got this central control as white, you know? You've got the Smith-Morra gambit with d4. Again, absolutely solid. If takes, and again, white's given up a pawn for some control. So there's lots of ways for white then to wrest back the initiative from black with the Sicilian as well. I mean, you can say that for any opening really, but I think the reason why I'm liking the French right now is because, yeah, you see this almost every time. In fact, we'll just pull up the Explorer quickly, and I'll see how often that is played in my previous games. Okay, so my games, playing as black, and we'll flip the board. All right. So, you should do this, by the way. Use the Explorer on chess.com. I think you need to be a paid-up member to be able to do this, so that you get access to your full previous database. So, I've had the King's Pawn opening played against me almost 3,000 times, okay, with me as black. So d5, I've played a lot of Scandinavian in the past, and I've had a 52% win rate, which is really, really good for black. At the higher levels, of course, you get more of an even proportion of win, lose, and draw. Very few draws in here. Only 5% of draws. So yeah, with the Scandinavian, but that's me climbing through the ranks from like 1,000 to 1,400. So you know, maybe that's going to happen. Maybe let's just limit this to rapid as well. Okay, so with rapid games, so the first couple of years I just played loads and loads of blitz, okay? And, you know, with blitz, something like the Scandinavian makes sense, because you're immediately saying to your opponent, I'm going to take control. And if you might know a few tips and tricks and traps and stuff like that. But in rapid, everyone's got more time to think and find the best moves and stuff like that. So in rapid, my number one response has been d6, and I've played quite a lot of this Black Lion opening. I'm not really playing that at the moment. I think it's probably better suited to blitz play than it is to more rapid or longer time controls. And I've got 48% against 48% for white, so it's pretty even with a Black Lion. My second most has been e5, but this is all time, remember. Okay, and I've had 54% success rate with that. d5, the Scandinavian. In rapid, I've actually got 62% success rate. And then e6, the French, 55% success against 42 for white. 55 against 42, playing as black, that's really, really good odds. So I've done extremely well. And now we can see that 2/3 of the time, basically, d4 is the next move. Okay? And I always play d5. And with this, again, 54% for black against 42 for my opponents. Okay? And at the intermediate levels, since I've been playing the French, I really didn't play it at all earlier on, e5 is the most common move. The French advanced variation has been played probably 60% of the time. And again, I've got 52% hit rate against 42 for white. Okay, the second most has been pawn takes, e takes d5, and there I've got a 63% success rate, but only 41 games. Okay, so it's a really good idea to go back to use chess.com's Explorer and look for yourself what have been historically your most successful responses in move one, but also other, go a little bit deeper and look at which lines work. So both of these have been very, very successful for me. Also from here, knight to c3 has been played a few times, and again I've got 52% against 44. Bishop to d3, this move, that's been very good for me because it actually undefends this pawn. Yeah, bishop to d3, I've got a 67% hit rate, so that's basically 6 games. I've won 4 of them, so you have to take that with a pinch of salt. But this is definitely worth doing, and like I say, I like the French. I like it a lot. So I may persevere with this. You know, you get people at Grandmaster level who will always play the London system, or they'll always play the French against 1e4, you know. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with you. You might be 900 rated now, right? And you might say, actually, do you know what? I like playing the Dutch, or I like playing the English opening, or I like playing the London system. There are Grandmasters who always play the London system as white. Every single competitive game that they play. Always play the London system. And the London system experts. Nothing wrong with that. You don't have to be, you know, a promiscuous with your openings. There's, you know, reason I play a range of different openings because it would be pretty boring for people who subscribe and like watching my videos to keep watching, you know, the same opening over and over again. But, you know, this is a competitive game. It's for points. You know, so I'm going to play the French because it's what I know the best, and like we say, it gives me that initiative from the off. So yeah, much happier camper today. I hope that's given you a few tips, a bit of food for thought. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to Chess Bootcamp if you haven't subscribed, and I'll see you soon.